Wood. I am an assistant director of admission here at Birmingham Southern College. So just to say welcome everyone. Thank you guys for coming. Hopefully a couple more people shuffle in while we do introductions. But I was able to be the workshop chair for this event this year. So I'm very excited to be a part of this. And I wanted to introduce Catherine Chastain, who is the SACAC State and Area Initiatives co-chair. And she'll introduce herself and we'll kind of go down the line.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for being here today. Alabama has not had a drive-in workshop for a couple of years. And so huge shout out to Sydney and Trent for taking on the challenge of not only planning a drive-in workshop, but planning the first ever virtual one. So truly, I have to give them so much credit. Sydney and Trent have done such an incredible job, and we're so thankful to have schools that will step up and say, let's create some amazing ways for our counselors in our state of Alabama to gain some professional development. And the beauty of it being virtual is from the comfort of wherever you are at right now. So thank you so much to Sydney and Trent. And I am super excited for today. And so I will go ahead and pass it off to Trent as the Vice President for Enrollment Management at Birmingham Southern. Does some great work, and we're so excited to be able to be here today. So thank you, Trent.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks to SACAC, and those of you all taking the time to join. We had actually a really strong turnout in terms of folks that had RSVP'd for the event. We know that life gets absolutely crazy, and so we appreciate you all taking time to join us today, and we're really thrilled to be able to host this right, on campus via the Zoom account. So, but a special thanks to SACAC and Catherine, and I honestly, don't give me any of the credit. It's Sydney Sherwood that pretty much did all of this work in order to make this happen. I just kind of said, yes, we're doing this, and then handed it off, and I'm really fortunate for that. But we're really fortunate as an organization, and I know many of you all are SACAC members. Some of you all may not be SACAC members. The beauty of this is this event this year is free, courtesy of SACAC, to whether you're a member or not, and we're just absolutely thrilled to be able to afford that to counselors from across the state. But we're also really fortunate to have within our state the SACAC president-elect, right? You'll be officially president in April at the annual meeting. And so I asked Tyler Peterson from University of Alabama, Birmingham, to join us and say hello and give a quick welcome before we get started. So Tyler, I'll hand it off to you briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot, Trent. And yes, we all know that Sydney did all of the work to put this together, along with Catherine. So thank you. So as Trent said, my name's Tyler Peterson. I'm the president-elect of SACAC, and we'll take over as president in just 2 weeks. I wanted to provide a brief overview of SACAC. I know many of you on here are familiar with us. Some may not be. We are an association consisting of 9 states and the Caribbean, with about 2,000 members. We offer professional development workshops, grant opportunities, as well as student workshops as we really advance our need of serving students to meet their post-secondary goals. I am excited to share with you that this year we have decided that our conference will be virtual, which that's not a surprise, but that our conference this year is free to members. And it's also free to public school guidance counselors, community-based organizations, and members of HBCU offices. So if you fall into one of those categories, the conference this year is free for you. And it's April 19th through the 21st. We've got great keynote and featured speakers. Anthony Jack, author of The Privileged Poor, will be our keynote speaker on Monday the 19th. We've got great sessions, and we think we've designed a great conference that will leave you inspired, encouraged, challenged, without excessive Zoom fatigue. So definitely check us out. Hope you can attend the conference. Thank you to all that are here today and for putting on this event.
Awesome, thanks, Tyler. So we're actually going to go on and dive in and get started with our content session. So we actually have 3 speakers lined up for you today. I have little ones at home, and I was thinking about what this intro was. And the reality of it is today's SACAC Drive-In is brought to you by the letter J. So we have Jeff, we have Jessica, and we have Joe all presenting to you this morning. So we have completely coincidence in that. So we're going to get started and hand things off to Jeff Kalley. Jeff is the one of the senior vice presidents at RNL. And has very successfully had a career working with colleges and universities. One of the things that he is extremely passionate about and really a thought leader on within the higher education space is understanding generations, American generations, and how we talk, communicate, and behave with one another, and what that does in not only our work in college admissions, but also our interpersonal relationships. So he has given probably 55,000 conference sessions, and we are absolutely thrilled to have Jeff on the docket today to be joining us. So on that note, I will hand it over to my good friend and colleague, Jeff Kalley. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Trent. Great seeing you. I feel the pressure on, like Vice President of Birmingham Southern, President-elect the SACAC, Tyler Peterson. Like, whew. Well, the good news is for all of you attending, I'm so thrilled to be here. I wish it was in person at a hotel. When will SACAC's conference be in the Caribbean or the Caribbean?
Tyler, I think that should be your presidential legacy. We go to the Caribbean.
Yeah, yes, that's number one on the agenda item, Jeff.
Okay, great. Well, they started the worst presenter first, so it's all going to be uphill for you all, but I am really happy to be here this morning. I very quickly want to manage expectations. When we train ambassadors, we tell them to do that. I normally I would be coming to you from my home office in downtown Birmingham, but I'm taking spring break down at a friend's home in the Villages, and they have two dogs, Buddy and Angus. So there's a good chance Buddy and Angus might vocally be joining us if things come by, but dogs barking are the new norm, but hopefully not. So I'm going to share my screen and dive into this for the sake of time. And hopefully, let me see here if I do this right. I'm not a PowerPoint guy. Everyone's got my screen? Full screen? We're good, Sydney? Okay. All right, Trent, thank you for that introduction. So I have the greatest job on earth. I tour colleges for a living. And part of that for the past 20 years has been helping people understand who's coming to visit us. So talking with Sydney, we thought we'd want to do an overall of American generations from the pandemic and parents and students and a new cycle that's happening, which is kind of cool that we get to witness a turn. And that will make sense to you as we go along. Back to managing those expectations on our time this morning. Very quickly, Trent explained a little bit about who I am and what I do. Then I want to get into American generational theory, talk about today's college-bound parents, predominantly the parents Gen X, Gen Z students who many of you all here with us this morning are participating in. Are already helping with those students, but then talk about who's coming next down the pike, because that's going to happen really soon. So that's going to kind of be our enrollment funnel this morning. And if I can, in the chat, for the sake of time, if you want to put in the chat which generation you think you're a member of, you feel like you're a member of. Like, to me, generations are like pronouns. It's whatever you think is your choice on that, but just put it in the text if you identify as a boomer, an Xer, or a millennial, a Z, just so we can kind of see that. That would be great, and we'll go from there. So 3 things also on some clarifications on this. I'm going to be talking about theory. And theories of Howe and Strauss. I wish it was my theory, but I'm borrowing from Howe and Strauss, who have spoken at NACAC several times. They're the gentlemen that wrote American generational theory. They named millennials, and we're going to talk about that. So I'm just so this is theory. Some people are questioning their theory. They're questioning a lot of things. And the second part is generations and generalizations, right? It's derivative, it's derived. So I'm going to be making sweeping generalizations here. The great thing about America, right, and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is we're all individuals and we embrace that individualism. And when we were born, where in America we were born, to whom we were born, gender, class, race, education, religion, all of these things help form who we are. So, and I think that's also important too, that, and I hate to use this term, but every student is truly a market of one, that we can no longer just mass communicate to students in both our K-12 college-bound efforts and our college efforts, because they're all individuals and they expect us to know them in this world. So that's one of my clarifications in all this. All right. Every time I talk about generations, I share this photo, which is my family, the Kalley family, circa 1965. Now, a lot of people think I'm the one in the middle, but I am not. I am the one with his head cut off, sitting on my dad's lap, right? So there's a lot of Kalley family dynamics, but again, talking about who you are and where you come from. So my grandparents immigrated from Eastern Europe and landed in another steel town, Pittsburgh. It's part of why I love Birmingham so much. And my brother and I are first generation college grads. Now, we were born on the boomer Xer cusp, and he's the older and is more that idealistic boomer, and I'm kind of the reactionary Gen Xer, or the bitter Gen Xer, as a lot of my friends call me. So throughout our presentation this morning, if my bitter Gen Xer comes through, I'm just telling you, I'm going to blame it on my parents, as I blame everything wrong in my life on my parents. So that's the expectation of that. As Trent said, I have the greatest job on earth. It has been, unfortunately, like many of you all, grounded, and campuses haven't been open. But normally, I'm traveling a lot and visiting colleges and working with them on their campus visit events, their open house events, their accepted student events, hopefully making it more authentic, engaging, memorable, and fun for your students and their parents when they tour campuses. In Alabama, we've worked with Auburn, Birmingham, Southern University of Alabama at Birmingham, and Auburn Montgomery, and love SACAC, and have lots of SACAC clients. So normally I'm out there traveling, and hopefully we'll be again. For 14 years, it's been all about the campus visit, lots of campus visits, lots of tour guides, and lots of educating faculty and staff about American Generations too. We joined R&L back in September of 2019 and are part of that big thing. So, all right, let me dive into Howland Strauss's generational theory for you. And I'm going to give you a link to all their books at the end. But if you haven't read Howland Strauss, maybe you won't need to after this presentation. But again, there are two main books that came out about American Generations and what they call fourth turning. They also wrote the book on millennials back in the 90s and called Millennials, and wrote Millennials Rising, Millennials Go to College, and Millennials in Pop Culture. They only wrote one book about Gen X. And again, that's my bitter Gen Xer coming out here. So I'm going to take their theories and share them with you in this. What you will find fascinating is, in our great country, generations repeat themselves. And I believe it's because inevitably we become our parents. As much as we fight it, even like in The Breakfast Club, when they're all sitting around that classic Gen X movie complaining, they're like, we're never going to become our parents. We inevitably do. And that gets into this repeating pattern in America. Now, another disclaimer, Howland Strauss concentrates on America as a country. So of course, there have been millennia of generations of Native and Indigenous people here, but this is about European colonialism and the development of America as a country. All right, so let me clarify that too. There were 4 generations under European colonial rule, either British, French, or Spanish. But now we're going to hone in on America as a country. And what happens is that pretty much in America, a generation lasts 20 years, 2 decades. Now we're questioning that as we're living in this accelerated culture in all things, right? Communication, news, social media, everything is so quick. does a generation really last 20 years anymore? Because even if you think about millennials and the first cohort of millennials that were born in the 80s, and that last part that, you know, the one that grew up or became young adults or in college before the Great Recession, and the ones that came after, really two different cohorts. I think we could say that now about the new generation. There's quite a difference. So is 2 decades too long? There have been 15 generations that know America as a country. And right now we're birthing the 16th, and we're going to talk about that at the end of this. And they fit nicely into these repeating categories. I also hope you learn something about parents, students, your colleagues and coworkers, and yourself. Every time I present this, faculty members will come up to me and say, oh, now I get my kids. Oh, now I understand my grandkids. So hopefully it's a broader learning that you'll apply within this. So let's dive into these generations and how they work. So if you see, a generation is a cohort that shares a history. That's all it is. However, they fit into a cycle where predominantly one major historical event has impacted our history. So the first up is the revolutionary cycle. Again, we had 4 cycles under colonialism. And so the American Revolution impacted these generations in some form or fashion with some sense of immediacy in different times in their life. So you see there's a name of a generation, their birth years, you see they're about 20 years or so, but what I want you to hone in on is the personality. We start a cycle with an idealist generation. Idealistically, they're going to change things, right? They're going to lead the way. Extremely positive. These tend to be very large generations. And then the generation following it, because every generation rebels against the generation before it, right? We rebel against our older siblings, or we try to be different, is what we call a reactive generation. They tend to be smaller and also have a lot of Great Depressions, Great Recession, or wars happening during their time. And then we get to a civic generation, and this is the third one. And you see their names, and if you know American history, these names kind of make sense, because Howe and Strauss named generations more based upon the history, not about this alphabeticalness that we've gotten into here of late. A civic generation that comes together as a people and does something great for our country. And then the last generation are called the adaptives. They're ones that we know the least amount about. I like to say, because I think the other 3 older generations of siblings have taken all the energy and everyone's tired. And then it is what we call a turn, and another historical event impacts the next group. And that second generation is the Civil War cycle. And so you see that we only had 3 this time. And I want you to remember that, because we're going to revisit this notion. So again, probably until now, the most divided America has ever been as a young country. And we did not have a civic generation because we did not come together as a people, right? We were divided. So this is the one cycle to date that has 3. Then we get to our third cycle in the Great Power Cycle. And this is the rise of America, particularly like with World War I and coming out of the Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age, and the building of America and the rise of America as a global power. Now, if you look at the missionary generation, idealistically, right? A lot of colleges and universities were built or open around this time as seminaries to train teachers or preachers, right? We, in both Catholic and Protestant, we built a lot of colleges to train this generation to go out and be missionaries, right? To conquer the world for the Lord, very idealistically. Then we get to the lost generation, reactive, particularly the men of that generation that fought World War II, as you see when they were born, World War I, and were very disenfranchised and were lost. And many of them, just the men of that generation, bummed around Europe, right? We had come out of the turning of the century, the rise of the Industrial Revolution, fighting World War I, but then coming together to get us out of a depression and to fight fascism is the greatest generation, or the GI generation, who are civic. And then the silent generation. My parents, whose photos you saw, Rich and Janet, in a younger age, they were called silent because they were born into the Great Depression and World War II. And as children, they were somewhat marginalized. They were silent. And what's amazing is the America we experience in our youth impacts the adults we become. So if you look at the silent generation, they were very risk averse, worked for the same company, lived in the same house their whole life, right? Really, because of the risk they had experienced in their life. So that takes us to where we are all now, right? And the millennial cycle and the turning of the millennium is what impacted all these generations, and we all shared in it in some way. So the baby boom started, and this was what's really fascinating. Saturday Night Live just did a hilarious skit about boomers got the vax. And if you want to have a hey boomer moment, watch it because it's really funny. But most people think the baby boom started in 1945. It actually started in 1943 when we saw we were winning the war, for what that's worth. So you think about baby boomers, 72 million of them, born in a post-World War II industrial America, height of empire, right? And they idealistically changed America in a lot of ways. They challenged institutions and really changed America. So they were predominantly our parents, and I'll get in, let me pause for a moment. Then our Gen X, that's me. Who else said they were Gen X in the chat? I can't bring up the chat. We got some Xers. Tyler's an Xer. All right. Some people are on the cusp. Like we could do 3 hours on cuspy kids when you're born on that cusp. That's why I always say, don't get caught up in dates. Get caught up in how you feel. So for 20 years, we loved kids, and then we got tired of kids. And there are only 62 million Gen Xers. Why are colleges and universities clamoring for students? Because history is repeating itself, right? If you're old like me, that started my career in the 80s, right? Marketing was new to higher ed, view books, having campus tours. You went to college where your parents went to college, or where they wished they went to college, or where a teacher or a youth pastor told you to go to college. But then all of a sudden, after the post-World War and baby boom, and if you go to college campuses, there's a lot of 60s and 70s architecture because there were so many baby boomers. Then all of a sudden, there weren't enough students to fill the seats in the classroom and the beds, and colleges in the 80s started getting aggressive about marketing. So predominantly 72 million baby boomers predominantly birthed 76 million millennials. And millennials changed everything. And we built rock climbing walls and lazy rivers and sushi in the dining hall and luxury everything. And millennials went off to college. And now we're in the homeland, is what Howard Strauss calls them, this post 9/11 generation. And some people say 1995. I'm a Howard Strauss purist. So here's the deal. If we inevitably become our parents, throughout American history, predominantly what has happened is idolists birth civics, civics birth idolists, reactives birth adaptives, adaptives birth reactives. Rinse and repeat. History repeats itself. So your idolists and your adaptives are bigger generations. Your reactives and civics and adaptives, idolists and civics. All right, everyone good on where we're at and how we got here? Okay. So I'm gonna take you a little bit deeper here at SAC Alabama Driving, because y'all are very smart. And what Alan Strauss says is, besides that history that outlines the cycle, there are two social moments that impact generations: a secular crisis when we change institutions, and a spiritual awakening when we change inner behavior. And like clockwork, on all those generations that I just took you through, if you were to study history, you would see this repeating itself throughout our history as a country. Baby boomers had a spiritual awakening, questioning individual behavior at rising adulthood. So if you think about the summer of '68, Woodstock, Haight-Ashbury, civil rights, gay rights, women's rights, changing how we as individuals behave, right? That hit Gen X, if you'll look down on that next line, as we were being born and entering our youth. Then comes along a secular crisis where we changed institutions, 9/11, and we created Transportation Safety Administration. We created Department of Homeland Security. We created 311. You could no longer go out to the gate to greet a family member when they flew in to meet you, right? We created whole new institutions and changed institutional behavior in a more security state apparatus. Now, 9/11 impacted Gen X as we were going into midlife. So revivals, spiritual moments, war, recession, depression, like clockwork, all of these things have happened, right? So as millennials are called millennials, our civic generation, because they began graduating from from high school in the year 2000, 9/11, right as they're entering adulthood. So you see, unfortunately, according to this, I believe America needs a spiritual awakening in my editorial portion of this, that we need to change the way in which we as individuals behave, right? Not our institutions. And according to that, that's not going to happen until your high school seniors enter midlife. And I don't think America can wait that long. All right. Are there any questions about American generational theory before I dive into our Gen X parents? Clarifications. Something you learned.
I had no idea that generational theory went back as far as it did. I really, the first generation that I ever knew how to name, I think, were the silent generation. And so that was fascinating to see.
Okay.
I mean, you always hear history repeats itself, but that's so interesting to see it really, really repeats
Yeah.
itself.
And in their books, Generations and the Porturning, they really explain the names and outline this repeating notion, but then give you the history behind it. So I'm glad, Catherine. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jeff.
And you identify as which generation, Catherine?
I am a millennial, but there was a comedian once that said that older millennials should be called elder millennials. So I have deemed myself an elder millennial.
Yeah, I forgot her name. She's like,
yeah.
You remember
Liza Schlesinger.
You remember dial-up internet.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. That's great. Thanks. Good. I'm glad. And we're going to go in and predict the future at the end of this too. All right. Anyone else? All right. So we set up the bigger theory. Let's dive into parents. Now, I'm just going to give some disclaimers here. When I started when we started Campus Visit Consulting, I used to make fun of baby boomer parents, but they were nice. And they might have, but they were kind. They were kind to each other. They were kind to tour guides and ambassadors. And then but I would always make fun of them. And now karma has come back to get me, as I've now been observing Gen X behavior online and on campus tours, right? And so I like to say, if you look at a generation's music from their youth, it tells you a lot about them. So maybe Gen X is the lucky or unlucky 13th generation. I don't know. Born 1961 and 1981, and again, don't get caught up in dates. But 82 is that birth year for millennials because their first year graduating high school, the year 2000. That's why we call them millennials. I love Gen X. I am like platinum diamond medallion on the Gen X bitter bus, but we have some anger issues because of our disenfranchised youth sandwiched between two huge generations. So if you look at the music we created in our youth, we created hip hop and rap, right? And we created grunge, the Seattle sound. That's two angry forms of music from our youth. And I think that says a lot about us, all right? So I'm going to introduce you. There's a book called Gen X that came out as Gen X was graduating from high school and college, written by Douglas Copeland. And it's a fiction book and came out in 1902. And that actually gave Gen X the name Gen X. And the media hopped on it for a couple of years and everyone was about Gen X until boomers came along. Then in 2010, Jeff Gordner, another bonus J in our J today is all about J, another Jeff who was editor of Spin magazine at the time, wrote a great book called How Generation X Got the Shaft but Still Keeps Everything from Sucking. X Saves the World. So for your boomers and millennials, I'm going to explain, I'm not saying this, another Jeff is saying this, that you have this tiny generation of 62 million sandwiched between 72 million boomers and 76 million millennials, right? Sandwiched between boomer narcissism and millennial entitlement. Now, hopefully everyone on the line knows that this is the Brady Bunch. Sometimes when I show this to college students, they're not familiar with the Brady Bunch. But here's how he sums up today's Gen X parents using the Brady girls. So Marcia represents boomers because she won the birthplace lottery. And if you watch the Brady Bunch, Marcia got everything. She was first one to get a car, first one to get her own room, head cheerleader, homecoming queen, student council president, and Cindy's cute and special baby on board, okay? Representing millennials. In the middle, 62 million Gen Xers, or the Jan Brady of generations, all right? So you have classic middle child syndrome. And we see this on campus tours, that Xers their whole life have been following baby boomers for whom we built schools and closed them. We built a lot of facilities on college campuses for millennials. And now Gen X's parents are coming on college campuses where tuition has gone up, and they're kind of mad that, like, again, I'm now having to pay for the children of baby boomers, and they're not happy about it. So it's classic middle child syndrome. But this is my bitter Gen Xer coming through. As I like to remind everyone, in the Brady reunion, Marcia didn't have a career and was about to get a divorce. Cindy was still living off her parents, and Jan had a happy marriage and was a partner at an architecture firm that wasn't her dad's. X saves the world. There's my little plug. That got you chuckling. So how did they get here? Right? So the pivot was truly the Kennedy assassination, is what most people say, right? So let's take a look at some of the shared history that's impacted Gen X to be the way they are. And ultimately what you'll see is we as Americans no longer trust institutions. Gen X was doing that before it was hip, right? Because institutions bailed and failed on Gen X. Our families divorced, our parents divorced, big religion started losing attendees and cut programs. Public education came under fire. Our president resigned, and we don't trust institutions, right? So we're born during the chaos of the 60s, of things in America that needed to be challenged and changed. But we're writing this out as children, right? The civil rights movement, and then the assassinations in '68 of King and Kennedy. And then we're the generation that had the first home invasion murder play out on our home television, right? With the Sharon Tate murders and Helter Skelter. All of a sudden now my home isn't safe, right? With the television world. We grew up with the malaise of the Vietnam War, right? The one war we lost happened to us in our youth, okay? Then the oil embargo and the Great Recession impacts us, and our president resigns during the chaos of the 70s as we're celebrating our bicentennial. Not a really good time. Then we get into the 80s and the Reagan administration, and we outspend the Soviets, but we grew up in a Cold War, duck and cover, like that's gonna help with a nuclear bomb. And this whole time, Gen X has just had their head down, taking care of themselves. Now it's interesting, if you study millennials love teams, okay? And this is quite fascinating. Boomers and Xers were trained to be hardcore individualists, because that individualism is how we fought the collective mindset of communist Soviet Union Russia. Then all of a sudden, the Berlin Wall came down and teams were okay. And now all of a sudden, millennials were taught in teams, and everyone gets a trophy. And why do millennials love the Avengers and Harry Potters? Because everyone bring their strength, team up, and do good works. This is very counter to the boomer and the Gen Xers. And I think we're seeing this play out in our offices. You might have a Gen X boss who is just do it yourself, heads down, And then you have millennials that want mentors and want to be in teams. So it all plays out, right? The Berlin Wall comes down as we're going in. And then white Gen X thought America was in a post-racist world and then woke up to the fact that it wasn't, with the Rodney King riots and the O.J. Simpson trial, right? And then let's remember in 82, millennials started being born. Now, Gen X, if anyone remembers the pets.com sock puppet, before there was Chewy, Gen X is an extremely technologically advanced generation. And this is important to remember. We created that first .com 90s technology boom, right? And in our technology, we went from vinyl to 8-track to cassette to CD to MP3 players to streaming, right? Same with our movies. We went from having to go to the movie theater to Netflix and chill and everything in between. So Gen X is extremely technologically savvy as parents. All right, so along that way, millennials are being born, and then all of a sudden, Gen Xers started having, and again, born to baby boomers, Gen Xers started having babies. Not that many of them, because we as Americans now have less babies, and we have less people having babies, and we're actually heading to a negative birth growth, which isn't good, because that gets us in a place like Japan. That's a whole other story. So we get into 1999 and Columbine happens. And now we're birthing a generation that has grown up with school security and school shootings being the norm, right? And then 9/11 happens and changes everything. And then the whole time, Gen Z, or the Homeland generation, and originally they were called Homeland because after 9/11, we turned internal and we nested as a people, right? But the whole time Gen Z has been alive, their country has been at war in Afghanistan. Then the war in Iraq. And then the market collapses as the older Gen Zs are children and they see their parents and grandchildren and grandparents, and then add housing collapse. And the generation that got hit the hardest in the housing collapse was Generation X because they were first-time home buyers. So there's a good chance a lot of our families of X and Z might have had housing insecurity or are still struggling with it, or the long term that our Great Recession kind of played out. So this is impacting Generation Z. Loan is a 4-letter word with Generation Z. I hear it all the time from families. We don't want our child to take out any loan. They don't understand loan debt. They only hear what they hear in the news. They don't understand that it's proprietary. They don't understand if you graduate, you pay off your loans, but it is impacting our higher ed world. So along with having to overprotect their children in a post-Columbine, post-9/11 way, Gen X has also had to raise their children being the first fully born into connectivity, right? You millennials grew up with connectivity, but Gen Z was born into connectivity. So they've really had to overprotect their children. Add to it the near civil war divide of our country now, right? The pandemic and its impact, civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter, right? Attack on the Capitol, the divide continues. And Generation Z has grown up in a chaotic America. So what's this mean for Gen X as parents? So we used to call boomer parents helicopters. Here's the millennial, here's the parent, and they would hover. And maybe extreme ones that attack the school, the high school or the college, we call Blackhawks. Gen X parents do not hover, and we see this on campus tours. It's awesome. Howe and Strauss named Gen X and we know they're highly involved in college planning. Let me pause for a moment. R&L, our parent company, did a research that parents are highly involved in their search, in their planning, right? 77% are very much involved. And I think this is critical that we all, and it started with boomers and millennials as a co-purchasing unit. I know you all know it. We're filling out our applications. Parents are picking up the phone and calling the K through the secondary counselors on the line here today. But we've got to acknowledge it finally as an institute, as a college-bound process on both sides, on both the K through 12 and the secondary and the post-secondary, that we really truly have two audiences in this college search process, right? And in that process, Gen X parents behave what we call stealth. This is the Gen X parent that doesn't say anything on a campus tour and then ask a question that makes a tour guide cry, right? Like, you don't see them coming, they drop a bomb, they drop an atomic bomb, lay waste, and fly away, right? For the college people, I hear this all the time. Didn't hear from a parent. I come in and I get a telephone call with them yelling and screaming at me, or an email, right? And they're going to elevate me to the president, right? In that Gen X way. If I'm not happy with you, I'm going to go around you, because I've been doing that my whole life. The other behavior is what we call lawnmower, right? That they have had to overprotect their child in this America of the last 2 decades, and can be extremely aggressive in mowing things out of the way. And I think previous generations were embarrassed by that parent behavior, but we seem to see Gen Z just defaulting to it. As one Gen Z student said to me, my parents have been doing this my whole life, I'm used to it. That it is still a co-purchasing decision, but it seems to be more divide and conquer. Where boomers and millennials tended to be more divide and collaborate, it seems that Gen Z students allow their parents to vet particular things, and they're not going to worry about it, and they're going to worry about what they can. But I think with the enormous amount of angst we have created within Gen Z, I can understand that. How we hear these things playing out is, even in the virtual world and before, the most frequently asked questions were always by parents, and they tend to go in this order of an ambassador. Talk to me about safety. Is it safe? How safe is it? Do you feel safe? And safety is not just physical safety. It is gender. It is sexuality. It is food allergies. It is, if my child has anxiety issues, what counseling do you provide? And then this then is a classic Gen X. What is it you don't like about this place, right? That they feel that an ambassador is giving a script of Pollyanna, everything's perfect. And then what is it you don't like? And then we hear this, is this a red campus? Is this a blue campus? Is this a conservative campus? Is this a liberal campus? And our hyper divide. And auditing on virtual events, same types of questions are coming up in this, that we're all parsing and we're all looking for our tribe or posse, and we want to make sure the brands align with us. So we see that coming out. So what is fascinating is, my colleague Brittany Joyce said to me on a rental car, she said, have you noticed Gen X parents have flipped Maslow's hierarchy? That because institutions were good to boomers, they trusted institutions. And they wanted to know how a college and university was going to make their bumper sticker special child all the more special. What we have noticed with Gen X parents is they believe if they're paying for a college education, you better do the other parts, but because they don't trust institutions, their questions are all about parking, food, housing, the basics. That until I trust that you have the basics covered, I don't want to hear about anything else. Which is why over the last 5 years, we've been telling our clients to start with what they want to know first: housing, food, earn their trust, learn the basics, then take them into academics and move them up. And again, the pyramid of the hierarchy. This comes back to Gen X not trusting. We also know the other Gen X question is how much does it cost and what do I get for it? What is that ROI, return on investment? And that outcomes truly matter. In many ways, for some privates, outcomes matter more than cost. So we're trying to encourage our clients to show a lot of their outcomes of logos and places that their young graduates have gone to work in a variety of forms, because we watch parents look at this and they really, and students too, they really want to know about these things. Hey, one good thing about Gen X, research just came out that because of our age, because of our wisdom, because we've lived through so much, we do work at home very well, better than younger generations. And part of that is also our technology savvy. So how is all of this impacting the students married to their screens, heads down, communicating on their screen, and what is their behavior? A firm did a huge amount of research on Generation Z that I think is very sad. And I don't read slides verbatim, but I do want to read these two call outs, is what we're looking at is an entire generation that came to age in a period of culture clashing where the economic and social fabric of America seems to be fraying. Being a classic teen requires safety and space for carefree self-exploration, and Gen Z is not registering the world as that kind of place right now. So this article went on to say that being that traditional American teen that boomers, Xers, and millennials had is really not a luxury that Gen Z has in comparison, that this might be the last generation of what we all think American teenage is like, because they've grown up in a totally chaotic and divided America. Now, what's fascinating is every generation rebels against the other generation. Look at 51% of Gen Z says college is not worth it. I don't value college. So there's less of them and they don't value what we're selling. And because they were raised as children in the economic chaos of the housing collapse and the Great Recession, they are extremely frugal and fiscally aware, right? They're going to college, they're going to work. What's the internship? I don't want debt. This article in Adweek was phenomenal research that showed fiscally, Generation Z is far more advanced in their knowledge of money than boomers, X, and millennials at the same age. That the Great Recession and their access to technology and apps. And it is fascinating. During the millennial generation, I never had a student ask about debt. And I'll sit in an information session and a Gen Z will ask, what's the average amount of indebtedness of your graduates? Like, they are very savvy to finances, and loan is a 4-letter word. I think we all have to pause and remember that this class of 2021 and all of Generation Z from us needs a little bit of empathy, a lot more creativity to reach and connect them. The way that we have conducted the college-bound process is not going to work and isn't working. And we really need to get creative about them and understand, how do we connect them to each other? How do we connect them to colleges and universities in a way that truly works with them? And for me, I think this is the way to reach this angst-ridden generation that doesn't value what we do. As one ambassador at another SACAC member school said to me after I presented, she said, okay, so it all comes down to this. Gen X is angry and Gen Z has angst. And I was like, okay, that kind of makes sense. What do we do about it? I think as we're coming out of the pandemic, we're going to figure that out all the more. So let's talk very quickly about where we're going. And what's fascinating for you all is we're about to go through a generational cycle. So if we go back, right, our Revolutionary, our Civil War, our great power, and then we turn to where we're all at. Here's my prediction. Right now, millennials are finally having children, and we need them to get busy and have more children, because children help our economy and children helps what we all do, right? So boomers, so right now we're about to have a turn. And I believe as we're coming out of the pandemic, whatever this next cycle is going to be, I'm naming it the pandemic cycle, right? And we've already named the children of millennials alphas. And they're our new idolist generation, right? Because civics birth idolists. And if our economy does what it did yesterday, and we have another roaring, booming 20s, right? You're going to see a change in American behavior. And then all of a sudden, Gen Z is going to start having babies and they're going to birth the new reactives. And history is going to repeat itself. So now we've got to get ourselves ready. If we have a booming economy and come out of a pandemic, and the children of millennials who are going to be extra special and are going to want to be super idolists, we're going to have to change the way we're educating and recruiting these students. So that's my pick on that. Here are the 3 books about Generation X. Gen X is they were graduating from college. Gen X is they're entering midlife, and Gen X is they're nearing elderhood. You can want to check those out. And you can download this Parents Role in College Planning. If you just go to ruffalonl.com and to our resources page, we've got great resources for both college and K through 12. I think everyone might find this parent guide really kind of fascinating. All right, Sydney, how did I do on time? How did I do on presentations? Did we want to have some discussion, what we learned, what we didn't learn, clarifications?
I think we have some great time. Sorry, I'm not Sydney, but I think we have some, I think we have a couple minutes for if there's questions or discussion points. Jeff, I've obviously seen you do this once or twice before, or some version of this, and every time I still learn something along the way. So thank you for that. Other questions or thoughts or what people learned? Would love to hear that.
Jeff, I have a question when we start thinking about the point in time that we're working with high school students, we kind of target in on working with students in the 9th and 10th grade in architecture, design, and construction, but that's just simply because these are fields that involve quite a bit of skill sets, I guess, that are a little bit different. What would you say, based on your research or your knowledge, that are some of the best things that we could be honing in on that our parents will find, oh, wow, that's great that we're thinking about these things with these students early on. Obviously, you said housing and parking and those sorts of things, but is there any, you feel any specific, anything that we can think about that maybe our parents would really appreciate outside of those things?
Yeah, I think parents want to know, where will the jobs be, right? Where will the jobs be when my son or daughter graduates? And so what does that mean? Where will the design jobs be? Is that going to be in residential? Are we going to redesign our homes in a post-pandemic kind of way? Are we going to, as millennials inherit wealth from baby boomers, right? We're about to see the largest shift in wealth, right? As boomers die, if they don't spend it all, right? And does that mean that home renovation, are we going to build any more offices? Are we going to change offices because of the pandemic? So I think parents, it's so fascinating with Gen Z, internships are the new study abroad. And I think the pandemic has changed that even more. But even before the pandemic, like, I don't want to take out money for a loan. I need to get an internship. So job. How much money can I make? What will my earnings be right out of college? And so I think it's really more, one of our recommendations, I'm going to answer your question, Catherine, is if you think about career centers, and counseling centers, they used to be on the fringe of campus in the basement of a house. And those are the things that Gen X parents really want to know about. And so we've been telling our clients, bring those things front and forward and retell them, put them in your student center, show the logos, show the parents that the notion of a job and showing those outcomes. But I think giving a prediction on the economy and how you all are going to prepare for that, I think they want to see some basic business thought and the economics. And then it is fascinating how, and I'm torn with this, that, with housing, single rooms, private rooms, I think that they really want that safety issue is, will my son or daughter be safe, and clarifying what that is and making the data available to them. And then I think today, and then there are two jobs, Catherine, I would not want on a college campus, and that is president and director of food service. And I think in a foodie world, and everyone's got their allergies and to accommodate that, but they want that. Like, if we're selling place-based education, the place matters, because the pandemic has shown we can do this. So what am I getting for place-based education? Is that a long answer to your question?
No, that's a perfect answer. Thank you. That's great. Yeah.
Jeff, you talked about the fact that, like, you think that there's an acceleration in the cycles. I think especially given the pandemic we're in. I mean, I guess, do you think that's much like when we had like the Civil War cycle, we only had 3 generations within that cycle. Do you think that we're going to get to the point where we will either shorten an entire cycle, or is this like, I guess my question is this like a long-term thing or a short-term thing from your perspective? And, you know, could something like that happen again?
Right. So you'll notice on my pandemic slide, I omitted a civic cycle because that's the point I forgot to. So 2 points, Trent, is I think if our country continues the way we're going and history repeats itself, we will not have a civic cycle if our divide continues, right? You know, in China, because of their birth, a generation was lasting 10 years and now they're bringing it down to 5. So in China, there are 118 million 20-year-olds in their 20s. Yeah, and that's one cohort. Put that into perspective, 118 million. So I think we're going to go to 1 decade now. And probably, so if you want to make a lot of money, write the post-pandemic 21st century American generational theory to
I'll get on that.
Outdate Howe and Strauss. But I think it's going to change to 1 decade per generation because of our connectivity and the accelerated notion of it. Did that answer your question?
It did. Yeah. I'll start that book, you know, May the 2nd. Yeah,
and the scary thing is that if history, like when I was like, man, like knowing history, this, you know, we could have a repeat of no civic generation if we keep this up.
Interesting. Questions from others?
Or something you learned about yourself, your family, your students. Usually cuspers have questions. Like, I was born on a cusp. What does that mean? Is there something that you learned that has helped you with your students or parents? That's truly what I hope came out of our time together. I see head nods. Anyone want to share what they learned that will help with students and parents?
This is what our faculty feel like as they teach in Zoom classes now.
Well, if we don't have Catherine, if we don't have any other questions or topics, we can go ahead and take a break. Let everyone have some time to go get a drink of water or something, take 5, and then we will come back for our second speaker.
So I have 10:01, so we'll come back at 10:06.
Yes.
Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff.
Really appreciate your insights.
I'll make a PDF and send it to you, the slide deck, if things are like.
Thank you.
Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.
The rest of your drive in.
Thank you.
Happy SB21.
I had a little bit of snack act. That made me so happy in April.
There you go.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks,
Have a great rest of the day.
And we'll get back started in about 5 minutes. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We appreciate you all continuing to join us today. Really excited about our next speaker, one of my favorite faculty members here on BSC's campus, Dr. Jessica Pincham King. And so in the world of today is sponsored by the letter J. Jessica, we had Jeff just a minute ago and we have Joe later. So it's the letter J lineup today. So we are excited to welcome you and thanks so much for having a chance to join us.
Thank you for having me. And so just to be clear, I have about 25 minutes, correct?
You actually have as long as you need. So
Okay.
you can talk as long as you want.
Okay, I promise I respect you all's time. I really will. Okay, because I can go. So hi, as Trent described, it's so nice to join you. I'm very appreciative, honored, and humbled by the invitation from my good buddy Trent for this event. And I thank you for coming to my TED Talk. So I am the Engage Programs Area Chair at Birmingham Southern. So that's just all things hands-on learning, your research, internships, service learning, study abroad. And I also teach sociology courses. So I teach oppression and social injustice, intro to sociology, and I've sponsored a few study travel trips. And so a lot of the trips that I choose to engage in, they focus on intercultural learning. They have a focus on equity, inclusion and belonging, diversity, as well as they infuse critical reflection. So everything that I do infuses critical reflection pedagogy, even in my personal life, and it drives my husband crazy, but he's a better person for it, in my opinion. So today I prepared a PowerPoint for you all. And we're going to be talking about dialogues across difference. There's a text called Difficult Conversations. Has anybody heard of that text? Has anybody read that text with a thumbs up or a hand raise? Has anybody read it? No? A little bit of it? Jessica, you read a little, Catherine, a little? Okay, cool. So we're going to use that as a framework for discussion. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to hope. If you're a praying person, pray. If you rub your crystals or have sage, hold that, whatever you do. I'm very open to different belief systems, but I need you to do that to make sure that this PowerPoint goes as planned, okay? And sharing the screen. Technology and I have a love-hate relationship. And so hopefully it chooses to love me today, okay? And so I should be able to do this, right, Sydney? Yes.
Yes, you should just be able to click at the bottom.
Okay. Let's see.
Perfect.
Can y'all see that all right?
Fantastic.
Okay. And so hopefully it's allowed me to click through. I'm moving you all. So do you all see yourselves on the right side of my screen as I move this? You do?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to minimize you. So now you see Sydney? Everybody sees? Okay.
We still always see us, and we got your slides, so you can just click on whatever and we'll.
Perfect. So I'm going to keep going. I was trying to prevent you all having to see through everything. So difficult conversations. How do we talk about tough stuff? Okay. So let's just set some ground rules for discussion. And I always do ground rules whenever we may tend to talk about some things that may bring up some anxieties. And of course, I'm talking to a group of counselors, so you all are very familiar with counseling theory and communication processes. We all learn those things in graduate school, right? And so whenever we talk about, I'm gonna have you all jot some things down, so make sure you have your paper and your pencil ready. When we talk about these things, I want you to try your best to separate the people from the quote unquote problem, okay? Focus on interest, not necessarily someone's positions, and that'll make a lot more sense to you as we continue to move through the PowerPoint. Try to create or invent options for mutual gain. We're going to be talking about difficult conversations. So we all know that we've had a difficult conversation before. And so how can we invent options that each party has some gains in that conversation? You don't feel like I'm losing and this person is winning everything, right? So you're going to walk through a case that you create. And so let's try to be as objective as possible and come up with objective criteria as well. Use active listening strategies. You all are counselors, you all work with students and parents. And so I'm very confident that you will do that. And also raise questions when appropriate, let go when appropriate, and be self-aware. right? And do your best to be as self-aware as possible. And of course, maintain confidentiality, which is what you all do at best. So let's lay the foundation for this conversation about difficult conversations. We're going to talk about some issues, concerns, or points of contention, okay? And so with that, take out your sheet of paper. I'll give you all a couple seconds to make sure you get organized, flip your page, or do what you need to do. And identify your top 3 issues in your role as counselors that you've had a difficult conversation about, right? When I do workshops or trainings, I try to always make sure, even a talk, I try to always make sure that attendees can walk away with something tangible, whether that be a new strategy, a new tool, or a new skill set. And so I want that to be the foundation of our time together today. So identify your top 3 issues that you've had a difficult conversation about in your role as a school counselor. For example, maybe you had a student who had hopes of a prestigious school, but they have some very low academic achievement. And so you had to engage in a difficult conversation with that student and or with their grown-up about what's a reasonable option for that student, or what may be the best option for that student. Not to say that they can't go to a successful school, but how can they incrementally and intentionally attain that goal? Maybe the conversation was about a microaggression a student experienced in the classroom, which is a subtle slight that's not really on the surface, but it's very offensive. And typically they're around race. They can be around gender or gender identity or religion. So maybe a student experienced a microaggression and they disclosed that to you and you had to have that difficult conversation. Maybe you heard a comment that somebody said. It could have been one of your colleagues or a student or someone else or a parent in passing, and you were afraid to say something because you didn't want to be insensitive, or you didn't want to engage in that conversation because it made you feel funny, but you weren't comfortable with what the person said. Okay, so I'll give you all a couple more minutes, 1 minute, to identify your top 3 issues. Does everybody have it? Can you unmute yourself and say yes or no? Because I can't see you on the screen. Yes? Okay, I'm going to assume that everybody has theirs. Okay, so now I want you to use your magic wand. Some of you are familiar with this from counseling or counseling theory. I have something in the chat box. Yes, thank you, Catherine, for putting in the chat box. So now I want you to use your magic wand. If things were how they should be, right, in your opinion, what would they look like in terms of that conversation, right? Who are the main players of the conversation? How can the conversation be about the issue or concerns? So say, for instance, my issue is the prestigious hopes with the low academic achievement. The main players may be the student that I'm working with, and it may be the student's grown-ups. I like to use the term grown-ups because people have diverse families and the people that are raising them may or may not be their parents. So maybe it's their grown-ups. Maybe it's an aunt that's helping to raise them, and maybe it's the grandmother, and they're the main players, where the grandmother just wants the child to go to college. They're happy they're going to school, and the aunt is like, no, we need this school because this will set you up for a future of success, right? So those are the main players. How can there be a conversation about the issue or concerns? Like, what are some things, basic notes, not anything long. How can you have a conversation with aunt, grandma, and student about the concerns about the student's hopes of a prestigious school and their low academic achievement. And lastly, if things were how they should be in terms of the conversation, not the setting, what would it look like, right? Would it look like we come in and we identify some schools that work for this student's GPA and test scores and interest, and we have a conversation and we narrow that down and we support the student to what the application process looks like? What would that look like? I'll give you a couple more seconds. And in the chat box, can I get some ones if you're ready for me to go on if you've finished this portion, or two if you are not? Okay, I see ones. Okay. I'll wait till I get a few more ones in the chat box and then we'll move on to the next slides. Okay, perfect. So we're gonna move right along. And it's okay if you don't have this completely filled out, you'll still be able to engage. Okay, so let's share. So only share one issue and you're not required to if you don't want to. I'm gonna stop the slides and we're gonna pick back up after we share our one issue. Okay. So is there anyone that would like to share the issue they identified?
I think I talk a lot with parents. Probably one of the most difficult one is parents who are disappointed about college outcomes, right? They might have had hopes for their student to be able to go to a certain school, maybe their alma mater or a place that they had come up with in their head that was the perfect place for them. And then, you know, the student gets denied and not accepted at that school. And so they come to me a lot to sort out their feelings about that. And it's difficult on my end because sometimes that answer actually makes a lot of sense, right? From my admissions experience, my years in college counseling. Sir, I knew that they were not going to say yes to your son. Like, that's not a thing. Despite the fact that we were all very hopeful. Other times it's not that way. It's like, yeah, they were certainly well qualified and we would have hoped for that, but it didn't turn out that way. And so that's probably pretty common and obviously on my mind right now as, you know, we're in the springtime.
Yeah.
So I found that parents just want to be heard, right?
Okay.
They really want to share their feelings. And as a counselor, not only do I work with the students, I also work with the parents. And so just listening and validating their feelings that, yeah, that's totally legit to be disappointed is something that I try to do on my end. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, that's something that I have to navigate, especially this time of year.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. Is there anyone else that would like to share the issue that they identified? Is there another issue aside from the disappointment of not getting accepted into the school of choice? Is there a different issue?
I think a conversation, was someone else gonna go? Sheila, did you wanna go? I saw you unmuted. Okay.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
it's been difficult with parents that do not support the student's choice for college. One instance, which was quite severe, I thought, a student had applied early to UPenn and was accepted, but she had also gone behind. The mother had her apply to MIT and other Ivy League schools. Well, she also got into MIT, so the mother comes in, doesn't want her to go to UPenn, wants her to go to MIT. And That has been very difficult conversation with parents to help them understand that that was a contract that they signed. You tell them ahead of time, but in the end, if they, don't see the importance of abiding by the rules, it's just difficult to speak with parents who aren't supportive. And this is where the child wanted to go with UPenn.
Yeah.
Very difficult.
I can imagine that is difficult, right? And trying to support the student in their autonomy, but also respect the parent and not get too engaged in any parental child conflict, but then also, do your part. I know that, yeah, that can be difficult. Yeah. Sydney, what were you going to share?
I was going to share from the admission side. I think, currently a lot of our conversations, the conversations I'm having are around financial aid. And oftentimes those can be harder conversations. And I think to mirror what Jessica Fornash was saying was, I found listening and validating their concerns and their feelings is really helpful. And, just taking the time to do that, at least on our end, that's kind of what I felt more recently.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you, Sydney. Is there anyone else that has an issue or conversation they would like to share that may be different from what's already been shared?
Well, mine is discussing death or grief with the students and with their parents. Sometimes the parents look at it like they just have to deal with it or get used to it. And sometimes it helps when they have someone to discuss their feelings and the person that has passed on, the things that they used to do, now how they'll handle those things and so forth, to help them to deal with or get over or accept the death a little bit better. But I find that a bit difficult to discuss with the child and sometimes the parent.
Okay. Yeah, that one is that's similar to the conversations that a lot of us educators and support staff have around depression, right?
Yeah.
Like students have real feelings and experiences with depression. And a lot of the times with some families you hear, well, what do you got to be depressed about? Right? Like you have everything taken care of. Like you got food, you got clothes, I send you to school. It's not that bad. Some people have it worse than you. What do you have to be depressed about? Right? Like that's also a difficult conversation to have in terms of clearly the student is having some real experiences and we need to do our part in supporting that student so they can access some assistance and services for it, right? But you can't access the assistance, right? You can't access navigating grief if you don't have a conversation that this is real and it's happening, right?
Right.
All of these are good. Is there anything else anyone would add before we go back to the PowerPoint? Okay, and so hold on to these. We're gonna go back to them. All right. So let's share again. Share. Okay. So this is the text that I will be referencing throughout the rest of the presentation. It's a bit of an older text called Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most. And it's a very easy read in terms of vocabulary and verbiage and concepts, but it's difficult in the sense of actually applying the concepts. And so I use this as a framework. I'm not 100% drinking the Kool-Aid on this book. However, I think that it does give a good foundation to help us, the collective us, map and navigate difficult conversations and make sense and make meaning of them so you can take subsequent action. Okay, and so the authors identify a difficult conversation as anything you find it hard to talk about, right? There's no rocket science, theoretical construct with all the statistics behind it. Of course, they did research to support this book, but it's just anything you find it hard to talk about, right? And so oftentimes we find that the underlying structure of all different difficult conversations is the same. right? And so each of these conversations, we make predictable errors, and those errors end up distorting our thoughts and our feelings, and they often get us into trouble. So what does that look like, right? So any difficult conversation, these authors assert that in any difficult conversation, there are 3 different conversations happening, right? And sometimes they happen simultaneously. Sometimes one may present itself before one or the other. And then there may be times that one kind of rises to the top and the others are just there under the surface. And so these conversations are the what happened conversation, the feelings conversation, and the identity conversation. And Stone, Patton, and Hinton, they assert that over time, we must transition from a message delivery stance to a learning stance, right? And so often in a difficult conversation, you're negotiating message delivery versus learning while those 3 conversations are happening. And so what does it look like? The what happened conversation typically is centered around whose story is right or whose story is wrong. It's either or it's or. One person's right and one person's wrong, right? That's what happened, right? They meant to have this impact on me whenever they did X, Y, Z. This is your fault. This is why it happened, right? The what happened. And it may not be as dramatic as they did this, you did that. It's like, this is their fault. I didn't do anything. I'm not complicit, right? It can run the gamut on the spectrum. The feelings conversation relates to one's feelings being someone's fault, right? I should have went off on them. I should have given them a piece of my mind. I should have expressed myself. I'm upset because I didn't express myself, or I should have just stayed quiet and shut up and not even bothered with it, right? In the identity conversation, I am not XYZ. They're attacking my identity unfairly. And then the message delivery stance centers around, are you learning from this conversation? Are you trying to understand this conversation? That's the learning stance. And then the message delivery is you're centered on delivering your message, getting your point across. Okay, and the book there's chapters on each one of these conversations. I'm just giving you a brief synopsis for the purposes of this presentation. And so those are the difficult conversations. And at some point we have to take the learning stances, right? And so the learning stances look at the contributions of a difficult conversation, right? So as opposed to this side did X, this side did Y, this is this side's fault, and this is this side's fault, what might each side have contributed to the conversation? And this can be very difficult, right? If there is some very charged or negative behaviors or some very charged emotions. For example, the parent who, I'm more than sure, Ms. Sheila, that the parent was probably very angry about the student wanting pen and completing that form, right? And so it may be that's all that student's fault. They shouldn't have completed that form. They did this. All the contributions are on that student. No, let's look at both sides' contributions, right? And mapping that out, right? So with feelings and identity, you have to take the learning stance. What's at stake for people? So what would be at stake for that parent, for that student to go to Penn? What would be at stake for that parent, for that student to go to MIT, right? Like the feelings and the identity, what's at stake, right? What's at stake for the parent to be real and honest about their student that's experiencing grief, right? Identify the purposes. Why or why not has this taken place, right? You ensure a learning conversation happens by adopting a learning stance, right? As opposed to delivering a message, you adopt the stance that I'm trying to learn, I'm trying to understand, I'm trying to grow. What does that look like? That looks like asking questions. That looks like listening to understand as opposed to listening to do what? To respond, right? There's a shift that occurs mentally and emotionally when you're intentionally trying to listen to understand as opposed to listen to just respond and solve the issue, especially if we have a responsibility in our professional roles, and typically in the helping professions. Myself, I have a degree in school psych and I have a background in social work education. So in the helping professions, like our mind often centers around finding a solution, right? And using our training and skills and strategies to find that solution. And sometimes we have to really step back and dig deep into the learning stance and understanding, right, the conversation and being comfortable with maybe not having a solution at times and leaving things open. And so when you're doing that learning stance, some shifts occur, right? You shift from certainty to curiosity, being certain about one's feelings, what happened, right? To being more curious about what's occurring. You shift from debating, the going back and forth, the rebuttal, the listening to respond, to exploring. You shift from things being simple, black and white, how they appear, to looking at the complexity of the situation and critically reflecting on what occurred. You shift from either or to and. I have found this to be critical, just if I can take my presenter hat off and put my personal hat on. I found this last bullet to be very critical in general. And some of you may already do this. I may just be late to the party. Using the and stance, right? It's not either or, right? So what does that look like, Jess? For example, I'll give you an example from my personal life. My husband and I got into an argument about my son's asthma medication, right? And it was like, well, you said you were going to get this. Well, you didn't get that. Well, I was doing this. Well, why didn't you say anything? Well, no, I did not say anything. And, right, it was not my intention, right, to inconvenience you, as opposed to, I ain't saying anything, but you don't have to act like that. But I wasn't trying to inconvenience you. It's like, but you said it wasn't your intention, but you're saying, but, right? So the and can kind of shift a conversation. Yes, I offended you, and it wasn't my intention, right? Yes, you want your student to go to MIT, and that's not the student's interest. This student is choosing Penn, right? Does that make sense? It sounds very kind of vague and fluffy, but shifting to the and stance can make a difference, right? Because you're looking at the attributes of more than one perspective, and neither one nor the other. One doesn't have to be true for the other to be false. I hope I said that clearly. If not, please put it in the chat box if we need to go back. Okay, so let's go back to our own issues that we identified. Okay, so pull your papers back out. So looking at your issue that you wrote down, your concern and your point of contention, what type of conversation do you think was taking place? What stance was taken? And then importantly, what's the third story that you could identify from your issue, right? And that third story is not necessarily what's right or what's wrong, what's better or worse, it's just different, right? So for example, the student that's experiencing grief and the parent that just, I'm adding to your story a little bit, Shatanya, and the parent that just doesn't really understand why, and that's wanting the student to just get over it and move forward. We went to the funeral, the person's not here anymore, celebrate the life, move on, move forward. What would be the third story about that, right? So we have the student experiencing grief, the student that's frustrated with the parent, right? Because they want them to move on. We have the parent that's frustrated with the student because they see how successful and the potential that the student has, but this grief and depression is getting the best of the student, and they just want them just to get it together and move on with life so they can finish the school year out strong, right? What would be the third story, right? Maybe, and these are plausible explanations, right? We're inferring some information. It could be that this student, that person that passed, was the one person that student felt like really supported them, right? And really saw the good in them. And the parent may not know the extent of what that person that passed did. So this student may find it difficult to move on academically, right? Because their person is gone. The parent, the third story, may say, hey, I know that you all were close, and they will want you to continue on. They will want you to finish strong. And I think that's the best way you can honor them is by finishing strong. So just do it, right? You see how that third story kind of shifts the narrative, and it also may inform you all as the counselor and how you can approach that difficult conversation, right? So take a moment and answer those questions for your issue or concern. Sorry. Okay. So the first step in walking through your issues is to walk through those 3 conversations, right? The next step would be to, and this is if you were actually having a conversation about the issue that you identified, and we'll go back in a bit and have you all tell what your 3 conversations were happening. The next step will be to check your purposes and decide whether to raise your issue or concern, right? Then when you start that conversation, you start from the third story, right? And that's critical when having these difficult conversations, right? Because if you start from one perspective versus the other, that can kind of muddy the waters a little bit and make them murky. So you start from the third story, then you work backwards and explore the 2 sides, and then you engage in problem solving. Okay, so let's pause the sharing for a second and go back. Would anybody like to share what their conversations were and what the third stories were from their examples? Was that easy to identify for you or kind of difficult or?
I don't know if I have like the things that I wrote down surrounded a lot around like when a student didn't get what they wanted. And so how do we talk a lot about resiliency and about you are defined by the step you take after, not by the failure itself and those sorts of things. So when I'm looking at those, I can't think of like one right off the top of my head that like the third story was this, but I feel like so commonly we start the conversation and by the end of the conversation, the third story has come out and we finally realized like, oh, so we're stressed about all of these things, but really the root of the stress is way over here. And so let's start with the root of the stress. And so I think, I've so many sessions that I've been in recently have talked a lot about the active listening, and you already said it, and as opposed to just listening to respond, and so I think that that's been something that I've been working hard on is I like how you say the third story. I have really been trying hard to think about like what is really going on, why are all of these feelings come to the top, because I do feel so often it's trivial when they walk in. I didn't get this. And it's like, well, let's move on. But why, where's the root coming from? So I appreciate that thought of the third.
Yeah, and that's one of, as I said, when we started this off, that the text, I'm not 100% sold on the approaches, and that's one of the reasons why, right? They're saying start from the third story, but depending on your approach or framework or the strategies that you use, it may be that the third story kind of emerges as you're having this conversation. And I don't think that that's wrong, so to speak, but I do think that once it emerges after the conversation, that just as you said, Catherine, you take that third story And then that becomes your focus. And then you operate from here, and every subsequent step or every difficult conversation that then comes out of the issue that you're having. Yeah, I think that's perfectly fine. Thank you for sharing. Is there anybody else that would like to share their conversations or the third stories that come with their conversation?
I think in the example I use, the third story is kind of the parents' feelings, right? It's the students' outcomes on their applications to college. The third story is usually how the parent feels about these outcomes. They might be sad because we didn't get a yes from a school that they had gone to, or they're sad for their student because they know the student is sad. And so I like having something to call it, the third story, right?
Yeah, that name helps.
It does. And that's something I try to remind myself as well, is that, there are feelings of everybody involved, and it's not just the student. And so sometimes looking at that from the parent perspective does give me that kind of third story.
Yeah, and if you walk back and use the rest of the framework, like the other conversation, so that's like the feelings conversation that's happening, right? Like, oh, this didn't happen, I'm disappointed, I'm sad. But what about the identity conversation with that? Like, let's kind of play with that a little bit and pick that apart. So we have these students that for the past 12, 13 years, they've been busting their butts, right? They're going to school, they're doing tutoring, they're taking prep classes, they're doing all this community service, they're engaged in their extracurricular activities, right? They're studying, they're working hard. And if we talk about underrepresented students, they're trying to do all of those things with also other environmental factors, right? And societal injustices that make it like a literal uphill battle that seems to never end. And they're really, really doing their damnness, excuse my potty mouth, to accomplish this goal, right? And I think all parents, regardless of your background or your demographic, all parents want their kids to do well for themselves, right? And when you think about that, that's the part of the identity conversation too. Like, we've done all this and you worked so hard and we really wanted you to get in here, even if it's not the school that grown-up picked for the student, even if it's not the school that student picked, but grown-up picked, there's some part of the identity that comes with that, right? Like, and what might that look like? What did I do wrong? We did all these things and you still didn't get into that school.
Right. It's a reflection
right?
on the grown-up in addition to the student. They feel it.
Yeah. They feel that it's a reflection. It's really, when you think about it in the grand scheme of things, we know it's not. Right. But in that moment you do. And that's part of having these difficult conversations, when you walk back and you look at the different contributions and attributes of the conversation and situation, you map those out, and then you move to the third story that accompanies those various conversations. It's a lot. That's why I say the stuff is simple to grasp, but when you really start to walk it out, it's like, how do I have time for all of this and do my job, right? But it helps to provide a framework. So even if you kind of pull little nuggets out of it, it'll be helpful. Thank you, Jessica. Is there anybody else that wants to share before we move along? We're almost done. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so going back to this slide, to go over the steps one more time after we heard some examples, you walk through the three conversations, right? The feelings conversations, the identity conversation, the what happened conversation. So what happened, didn't get in, what are the contributions of that, right? Like, my feelings, I am pissed this student didn't get in. And let's be real, let's be very, very real about it. It makes it even more difficult when you hear from a parent or student, Trent and I know, and Sydney know this all too well, about your student, the grown up, the student didn't get in, but this other student did get in, right? Why did that student get in over my child, right? That's something that the parents are dealing with as well when they have these conversations. That's lying under the surface. So that's the feelings, right? Feeling slighted, right? The identity conversation. Walk through those. As the person having this conversation or possibly leading this conversation, check your purposes. Decide whether it is even worthwhile to raise your issue or concern, right? And if so, you try to start from your third story, but sometimes, like I said, that third story kind of evolves in the conversation. And once it surfaces, then you start from there when you go through and explore the other stories, the other two stories, and then you problem solve to your solution. Okay. So this is a tool that's useful, and I have a PNG of this, and I can have Sydney and Trent email it out to you all. If you're interested in having it, just let us know. And it just kind of gives some strategies for each one of those, right? So it's one thing to say, do all of these things, then it's like, but what does that look like in a real physical sense, right? So how do you start from the third story? Like, ask the questions about the three conversations, like kind of take a mediator perspective, explore where each story comes from, share the impact on you, take responsibility for your contribution, describe the feelings, reflect on identity. That's how you start from the third story, right? Also, let's see it in the chat. Okay, I will make sure you get that, Shatanya. Also, extend an invitation by describing your purposes and inviting, right? Make the people that are a part of this conversation partners in figuring this issue out, right? It's not, the onus is not on one individual to solve the problem and make the conversation go to where things are just magically better, right? And be persistent in that. Also listen from the inside out, and that's taking a curiosity stance. When we talked about the learning stances and the active listening, as Catherine described, right? So you focus on authenticity, and you're aware of your internal voice, right? Turn up that internal voice, and then also manage it as well. And then there are skills that you listen from the inside out. Inquire to learn, right? Don't just use questions to cross-examine. Ask open-ended questions and make it safe for people not to answer. I think a lot of the times, just as adults, we get into this mode where you ask a question, you expect an answer, right? I think we've all fall victim to that, and we all fall victim to feel obligated to give an answer at times, right? And it's okay to not have an answer and just allow people to sit with it, right? And reflect on it over a period of time, and ask for some concrete information to make things plain. A lot of these are strategies that you all as counselors are already quite familiar with, and that you already employ on a regular basis. Also, check for clarity and understanding, right? Paraphrase what you've heard, share what you heard to make sure you're clear on it, and also acknowledge people's feelings and empathize, right? Speak to the heart of the matter. Don't, this is key, this third to last arrow at the bottom, don't present conclusions as truths. You can present conclusions, but don't present them as truth. Share where they come from, right? And be careful with the exaggerations. Right? Celia says, yes, do not present them as truth. Indeed, okay? And so those are some strategies, and I'll make sure that you have this image. It's just a PNG image that my colleague and I created. We actually use this text to teach a course on difficult conversations. And it was much, much different from this, because the conversations that we focused around race, religion, oppression, ageism, and other issues. And we used some texts and some prominent TV shows to actually map through conversations and what was going on. And we use that as case studies. And so we developed that tool to help our students be able to shift through the text. And so I will open it up for questions. If you all have any questions, I may or may not have answers. I can promise that I may or may not. And I can also promise that if I don't have an answer, I will do my part in trying to get an answer to you, whether that be through email at some point. So thank you for having me, and thank you for your participation and your attentiveness. So if you have any questions now or later, I'm happy to answer them. And thank you, Sydney and Trent, too.
Thank you, Jessica. That was fantastic. We really appreciate it. Does anyone have any questions for Jessica before we? I don't see any. Trent, do you want me to announce next stuff, or you want me to?
I'll take care of it. You want me to?
Okay.
So Jessica, thank you so much for your insight, and I'm just fascinating stuff. Yeah. So really helpful stuff. So I appreciate it. And I
We're
think
very grateful for you
yes, very grateful.
helping us out today. That was fantastic. Thank you.
So our plan was to take a 5-minute break and then come back for our third Joe Chandler, who is going to do a session on the importance of sleep. Unfortunately, Sydney and I have received a text from Joe, and his wife is actually in the emergency room. So Joe, everything's okay. She's stable. They're running a whole bunch of tests. So that's what I know. But Joe will not be able to join us because of that. So we're actually going to wrap up at this. So Catherine, I'll hand it over to you if you have any closing comments or remarks, but we really appreciate the opportunity to have you all join us and the opportunity to have you host this. Hopefully next spring, we may actually do this in person, although I think there's something to be said about doing it virtually. So in our virtual world and not having to peel away from campuses and being able to do it as a true statewide initiative. So with that, thank you so much from our point of view. Thank you so much for allowing us. A huge shout out to you, Catherine and Sydney, for doing a lot of the legwork and most of the legwork, heck, all of the legwork, and I appreciate it. And so, Catherine, we'll hand it over to you for any other closing comments before we call it a day.
Yeah, I can take no credit. Truly, Sydney has done an incredible job, and I'm so psyched to get to work with her. I would also like to shout out and say that Sydney is fairly new to the world of college admissions and recruitment, and I'm always so proud of our new professionals when they hop right in and say, how can I get plugged in? How can I help? So really so thankful for her. And huge shout out to Jeff and Jessica. Wonderful sessions. I do have the pleasure of getting to go to these all across SACAC, but such good information and information I haven't heard from any other drive-in. And so thank you so much, Jessica. I think I want to bring you in for all of my ambassadors that I'm going to have to turn down in about 4 days for all of these difficult conversations. So, but thank you all so much. And to all of our counselors who have joined us, thank you for giving us your time. A big shout out for the conference next week. If you, even if you just join for a few sessions here and there, this is only a small taste of what you can get from the SACAC conference. And if you are working at a public high school, please know that this would be a free conference to you. And for those of us that are connected with SACAC, we firmly love and are very thankful to all of the information and joy that we gain from being able to work with one another and just sometimes commiserate and know that we are all often functioning with these same wonderful questions that our high schoolers and their parents bring to us. So again, thank you all for joining us. If you have questions about being able to attend the conference, you'll receive some follow-up emails from us and just respond, and we're happy to answer those. But thank you again. Huge shout out to BSU, and thank you, Trent and Sydney. We hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having me. I'll make sure that Sydney gets my email and that screenshot to send out to everyone. Y'all have a good one.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Sydney.
Thank you. Thank y'all.
Thanks, everybody.
Y'all have a great day.